The brain that shocked the NFL. What if the most disturbing discovery about Aaron Hernandez was not made in a courtroom, but inside a laboratory months after his death? In 2017, doctors examining the brain of the former New England Patriots tight end found stage 3 chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, at only 27 years old. The diagnosis immediately changed the way many people looked at the final years of his life. Dr. Ann McKee of Boston University's CTE Center said the severity of the pathology was unusually advanced for someone Hernandez's age. Researchers found serious changes in areas linked to memory, judgment, and impulse control, including the frontal lobes and hippocampus. The shocking part was not simply that CTE was present, it was how extensive the damage appeared to be. But this is where the story becomes complicated. Before Hernandez became a convicted murderer and died in prison, he was a highly talented football player with an enormous future ahead of him. At Florida, he helped win the 2009 BCS National Championship. The Patriots selected him in the 4th round of the 2010 NFL Draft, and he quickly became one of the league's most dangerous young tight ends. In 2012, Hernandez signed a 5-year contract reportedly worth $40 million. He was only 22 and appeared to be on the path to a long career beside Rob Gronkowski in New England. Then everything collapsed. In 2013, Hernandez was arrested in connection with Odin Lloyd's death. The Patriots released him almost immediately. In 2015, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 2 years later, he was found dead in his cell. That seemed to be the end of the story. Instead, it became the beginning of another one. His family donated his brain for research, and doctors discovered pathology that raised difficult questions about football, repeated head trauma, behavior, and responsibility. Yet researchers also warned against a simple conclusion. Finding CTE could not prove that the disease directly caused Hernandez's criminal actions. The brain could reveal damage, it could not rewrite history, and it could not answer every question about the man himself. What it did reveal was enough to shock researchers and reignite a national debate over what repeated football contact can leave behind. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from. Type 1 if you believe the NFL must do more to protect players from long-term brain injuries. Or 2 if you believe players must take greater responsibility for protecting their own health. And subscribe, because the next chapter goes back to the beginning. Before the headlines, when Aaron Hernandez was still one of football's brightest young stars. Before the headlines, Hernandez was a star. Long before his name became associated with prison and CTE, Aaron Hernandez looked like the kind of athlete teams build around. At the University of Florida, he became a major weapon at tight end and helped the Gators win a national championship in 2009. His athletic ability was obvious, and the NFL saw enough potential to select him in the 4th round of the 2010 draft. Hernandez did not take long to prove he belonged. In New England, he became part of a dangerous tight end combination with Rob Gronkowski. Defenses had to account for 2 elite receiving threats, and Hernandez quickly developed a reputation for his speed, physicality, and ability to create mismatches. The Patriots made their confidence clear by signing him to a 5-year extension reportedly worth $40 million. At just 22 years old, Hernandez had money, fame, and a future that appeared almost guaranteed. But professional success does not tell the entire story of a person's life. Football players can spend years taking hit after hit, while everyone around them focuses on performance. A player may look strong, healthy, and completely in control, while damage accumulates beneath the surface. Hernandez had already played football in youth programs, high school, and college before reaching the NFL. Researchers later explained that CTE is associated with repeated head trauma over time, not necessarily one unforgettable collision. That means the story of Hernandez's brain likely began long before doctors ever examined it. At the time, however, nobody could see that future. Fans saw touchdown. Coaches saw potential. The Patriots saw a young player worth a major investment, and Hernandez seemed to be moving toward NFL stardom. Then, in June 2013, his life changed almost instantly. Odin Lloyd was found dead near Hernandez's home, and investigators focused on Hernandez and several associates. The arrest turned a rising NFL star into a national criminal case. The Patriots released him, sponsors disappeared, and the $40 million future that once seemed secure was effectively gone. The speed of the collapse was almost unbelievable. 1 year earlier, Hernandez looked like a player who could spend the next decade building a career in New England. Now, his football career was over before he had even reached his prime. But the most important discovery about Hernandez would come later. After his death, doctors would examine the brain of the player everyone thought they knew and find a level of neurological damage that forced the football world to ask a completely different question. What had the game been leaving behind inside him? The night his NFL dream collapsed, the death of Odin Lloyd changed Aaron Hernandez's life in a matter of days. Lloyd, a semi-professional football player, was found dead in Massachusetts in June 2013. Hernandez quickly became the focus of the investigation, and prosecutors built a case around evidence involving Hernandez, his associates, vehicles, surveillance, and phone records. For NFL fans, the shock was enormous. Hernandez was not some anonymous player at the end of a career. He was young, talented, and recently rewarded with a massive contract. He was supposed to be building a future in New England. Instead, cameras surrounded his home. When Hernandez was arrested, the Patriots released him almost immediately. His career ended before he had even reached the age when most elite players enter their prime. His endorsement opportunities disappeared, and the contract meant to secure his future became worthless. In 2015, Hernandez was convicted of first-degree murder in Lloyd's death and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But another legal battle was already waiting. Hernandez also faced charges connected to the 2012 deaths of Daniel De Abreu and Safiro Furtado in Boston. In 2017, he was acquitted of those two murder charges. Just days later, Hernandez was found dead in his prison cell. He was only 27. That moment ended one chapter but unexpectedly opened another. After Hernandez died, his family made the decision to donate his brain to Boston University for research. That donation meant scientists could examine the actual physical condition of his brain rather than simply speculate about it. Months later, researchers announced the diagnosis that shocked the country. Hernandez had stage 3 CTE. The discovery was significant because CTE cannot currently be confirmed in a living person through a standard clinical test, in the same way it can be diagnosed after death through brain tissue. Researchers were now looking directly at the pathology. They found damage affecting regions connected to memory, judgment, and impulse control. That immediately created a temptation to connect the disease to Hernandez's behavior, but doctors were more careful. The existence of CTE could be established. The severity could be documented. The criminal acts could be documented separately. What could not be scientifically proven was that CTE directly caused those acts. That distinction became crucial. Hernandez's story was not going to produce one simple answer. Instead, it became a collision between law, medicine, football, and human behavior. The discovery raised questions about what repeated head impacts can do to a young athlete over time, and the deeper researchers looked, the more extraordinary Hernandez's brain appeared. The man had been 27. The damage looked much older. Inside Hernandez's brain, when Dr. Ann McKee presented Boston University's findings, one number immediately dominated the conversation. Stage 3 CTE at age 27? CTE is a progressive neurodegenerative disease associated with repeated head trauma. Researchers examining Hernandez's brain found severe abnormalities in areas with major roles in behavior and cognition, especially the frontal lobes and hippocampus. The frontal lobes help with judgment, planning, and impulse control. The hippocampus is strongly involved in memory. Hernandez's brain showed significant CTE-related changes in both areas, including shrinkage in the hippocampus and extensive abnormal tau protein. Tau became a key part of the story. Researchers study tau because abnormal accumulation of the protein is one of the defining pathological features of CTE. In Hernandez's brain, doctors saw patterns consistent with the disease, including tau deposits around small blood vessels. This was not something caused by one isolated hit. The pathology reflected repeated trauma over time. That matters because Hernandez had been playing football for years before he ever reached the NFL. Youth football, high school, college at Florida, and 3 seasons in New England all added to his history of exposure. Scientists could not identify which individual hits caused the damage. They could not say exactly when the disease began, but they could see the end result, and that result was severe. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was the contrast between appearance and reality. A brain can look relatively normal from the outside while showing serious microscopic abnormalities underneath. Hernandez's case demonstrated just how invisible neurological injury can be. Researchers also discussed an APO gene variant found in Hernandez, although they stressed that its role in the severity of his CTE remained uncertain. It was a reminder that biology may influence vulnerability, but science still does not have a simple formula, explaining why some athletes develop more severe disease than others. That uncertainty is important. Hernandez's brain was not a perfect blueprint for every former football player. It was one case, but it was an unusually important one. A 27-year-old former NFL player had severe CTE, and the condition involved regions that influence memory and behavior. The discovery did not explain his entire life. It did, however, make one fact impossible to ignore. An athlete can appear physically powerful while carrying serious damage that no one around him can see. And once the findings became public, the conversation moved beyond medicine. Families began asking questions, researchers demanded more data, the NFL faced more scrutiny, and Hernandez's daughter would eventually become part of a legal battle over whether the football industry should be held responsible for the consequences of repeated head trauma. Could CTE explain his behavior? Once Hernandez's CTE diagnosis became public, people immediately began searching for a connection between the disease and his behavior. At first glance, the connection seemed obvious. Researchers found serious damage in the frontal lobes, areas associated with judgment and impulse control. Hernandez had displayed a pattern of increasingly dangerous decisions before his arrest. But medicine does not work by simply connecting two shocking facts. Dr. Anne McKee made an important distinction. She could diagnose the brain disease, but she could not say that CTE directly caused Hernandez's specific criminal actions. That warning is essential. CTE has been associated with cognitive problems, mood changes, and behavioral symptoms, but one person's pathology cannot prove that a specific disease caused a specific violent act. Human behavior is shaped by many factors, including environment, personality, mental health, substance use, relationships, and life experience. Hernandez's convictions were based on evidence presented in court. His CTE diagnosis came later from examination of brain tissue. Those are two different processes answering two different questions. Still, the discovery mattered. It suggested that Hernandez may have been living with a serious neurological condition long before anyone knew about it. That possibility forced researchers and fans to think differently about the hidden cost of repeated football contact. There was also a broader lesson. If CTE can exist in someone so young, then the question is not only what happens to former NFL stars in their 60s or 70s, it is what can happen much earlier. Hernandez had played football for years before reaching New England. That means the repeated exposure that may have contributed to his pathology could have stretched across childhood, high school, college, and professional football. Researchers did not claim they knew exactly how much each stage contributed. They simply knew the damage was there. The case also showed the limits of hindsight. Once doctors found severe CTE, it became tempting to look backward and reinterpret every unusual behavior as a symptom. But scientists warned against doing that. Not every decision is a medical symptom, and not every person with CTE behaves violently. That may be the hardest truth in this story. Hernandez's brain may have been damaged. He was still responsible for the actions for which he was convicted. Both statements can exist at the same time. The tragedy is that the medical discovery came after his death, when nothing could be changed. The research could help future players. It could not save Hernandez. And that is why the next part of the story became so important. What the NFL, the Patriots, and Hernandez's family were expected to do with what had been learned, the $40 million contract that disappeared, Aaron Hernandez's financial story is almost as dramatic as his football collapse. In 2012, the Patriots reportedly gave him a 5-year contract extension worth $40 million. Hernandez was still only 22, and the deal showed how much the team believed in his future. That future lasted less than a year. After Hernandez's arrest in 2013, the Patriots released him almost immediately. The contract was terminated, and Hernandez never played another NFL game. That decision had enormous financial consequences. A player who had been positioned to earn millions over several seasons suddenly had no football income at all. The long-term career that could have produced additional contracts, endorsements, and retirement benefits disappeared overnight. But the financial loss was only one part of the fallout. Hernandez's reputation collapsed. Sponsors walked away. His name became associated with a criminal case rather than touchdowns and victories. The story shows just how fragile an athlete's financial future can be. A contract can look permanent on paper. It is not. A professional athlete's wealth depends on continued employment, performance, health, and behavior. Hernandez lost all 4 opportunities at once. There was also another painful irony. He had already reached a level of financial success that many players never experience. Yet none of it could protect him once the legal system became involved. The Patriots did what NFL organizations often do in such circumstances. They separated the team from a player facing extraordinary allegations. The football business moved forward. Hernandez did not. By the time he died in prison, the NFL career that once seemed destined to continue for another decade had been over for years. Then researchers found stage 3 CTE in his brain. That discovery created a new question about the relationship between football and what happened afterward. If repeated head trauma contributed to serious neurological disease, could the NFL be held responsible for failing to protect players from it? That question eventually moved into civil court. Hernandez's daughter, Afile, became the center of a lawsuit alleging that the football industry should be held accountable for the long-term consequences of repeated head trauma. The NFL strongly contested the claims. The legal battle would become complicated by the league's existing concussion settlement and strict eligibility rules. The science was one issue. The law was another, and the difference between them would become painfully important for Hernandez's family. The legal battle over his CTE. After Boston University revealed Hernandez's severe CTE, his family pursued legal action connected to his brain injury. Attorney Jose Baez announced a lawsuit seeking $20 million on behalf of Hernandez's daughter, Afile. The claim argued that the long-term effects of repeated head trauma had damaged Hernandez and deprived his daughter of his companionship. The lawsuit placed the NFL under renewed scrutiny, but the case immediately faced a major legal obstacle. The NFL had already reached a broad concussion settlement with retired players and families. That agreement included rules about who could bring separate claims and when players had to opt out. Hernandez's situation was unusual. He had not retired from football in a normal way. Instead, his career ended after his arrest and imprisonment. By the time the relevant legal deadlines arrived, he was no longer actively pursuing an NFL career. That created a dispute over whether his family could bring a separate claim outside the existing settlement. The legal argument became highly technical, involving dates, employment status, and the terms of the settlement itself. Eventually, a judge ruled against Hernandez's daughter's separate claim. For the family, the decision was devastating. The medical diagnosis was real. The brain damage was real. But the legal system was not simply deciding whether Hernandez had CTE, it was deciding whether the family could pursue compensation under specific rules established years earlier. The timing became especially painful because the settlement included provisions related to certain neurological injuries and suicides. Hernandez's death occurred outside the relevant eligibility framework, leaving his daughter without the path the family had hoped to use. It was a powerful example of how science and law can move at different speeds. Researchers can discover something new. Doctors can establish a diagnosis, but courts still have to work within contracts, deadlines, statutes, and prior agreement. Hernandez's case could not rewrite those rules. At the same time, the lawsuit kept attention focused on a larger issue: the long-term effects of football on the brain. The NFL had spent years facing criticism over concussions and head injuries. Hernandez's brain became another high-profile case in that ongoing debate. Yet even here, the scientific evidence required caution. The discovery of CTE did not prove that football caused every event in Hernandez's life. It did not prove that CTE caused his violence. What it did prove was that his brain had accumulated significant pathology. That finding was enough to raise serious questions about how the sport handles repeated head trauma, and those questions would outlive the lawsuit, because the real impact of Hernandez's case was not the amount of money his family could recover. It was the information researchers could carry into future generations of football players. The brain that became a warning after Hernandez's death, his brain became more than evidence of a tragic life. It became a research specimen that helped scientists better understand CTE. The condition of the donated tissue was especially important. Researchers said the brain was unusually well preserved, allowing them to study pathological changes in detail. That gave Hernandez's case lasting scientific value. Researchers could examine abnormal tau protein, structural changes, and damaged regions of the brain without having to rely on guesses about what had happened before death. The findings strengthened a growing body of research showing that repeated head trauma can be associated with long-term neurological disease. But Hernandez's case also highlighted an important limitation in CTE research. The brains studied by researchers are donated after death, and that creates selection issues. Families are more likely to donate the brains of athletes who had symptoms or difficult medical histories. So the results cannot simply be used to claim that every football player will develop CTE. Still, the pattern was concerning. A major study published around the same period reported CTE pathology in 110 of 111 examined former NFL players. Hernandez was not unique because he had CTE. He was unique because of how young he was and how severe the pathology appeared to be. That difference made his case unforgettable. The football world had already begun changing how it treated concussions. More attention was being placed on sideline evaluations, return-to-play protocols, and player education. But CTE raised a much larger issue. What happens when the problem is not one concussion, but thousands of smaller impacts accumulated over an entire career? A player may pass every test after a game and still have experienced another series of impacts that could contribute to long-term risk. That is why prevention matters. Better equipment matters. Better coaching matters. Better rules matter. And perhaps most importantly, better information matters. Players cannot make informed decisions about their bodies if they do not understand the long-term risks. Hernandez's brain became part of that education. But there is another side to the story that should not be forgotten. Research can tell us what happened to tissue. It cannot reconstruct a person's entire life. CTE does not automatically explain every emotional problem, every bad decision, or every violent act. Hernandez's case remains medically significant without becoming a simple excuse for his behavior. That balance is crucial. His story should not be used to reduce everything to football caused it. It should be used to ask better questions. How early should brain protection begin? How much repeated contact is acceptable? What signs should doctors and coaches watch for? And how can young athletes understand risks before they become irreversible? Those questions remain open. And perhaps that is the real legacy of Aaron Hernandez's brain. Not an answer. A warning. What Aaron Hernandez's story really means. Aaron Hernandez's story contains several different tragedies at once. There was the football player who had enormous talent and a major contract. There was the criminal case that destroyed his career and led to a murder conviction. There was the young man who died in prison at 27. And there was the brain that doctors examined afterward and found to contain severe stage 3 CTE. Each part is real, but none of them explains the whole person. That is the most important conclusion to remember. Hernandez's brain showed serious damage associated with repeated head trauma. The discovery strengthened concerns about the long-term effects of football and helped researchers study CTE in unusual detail. But scientists could not prove that CTE caused his specific criminal behavior. That matters because a medical diagnosis should never be turned into a simplistic explanation for everything a person does. At the same time, ignoring the diagnosis would also be a mistake. The damage was real, the research was real, and the warning for football was real. Hernandez had already accumulated years of football exposure before reaching the NFL. And his case demonstrated that significant pathology can exist in a player who is still very young. The story also shows how quickly an athlete's future can disappear. A 5-year, $40 million contract once represented Hernandez's future. Within a year, his NFL career was over, the money disappeared. The career disappeared, the public image disappeared, and ultimately, his life ended in prison. What remained was a brain that could finally tell researchers something Hernandez could no longer say for himself. That is why his case continues to matter. Not because it solves the mystery of violence, not because it provides a simple excuse, but because it forces football to confront a difficult reality. The consequences of repeated head trauma may not always appear while the player is still on the field. For athletes, coaches, parents, and fans, the lesson is about prevention. Protect the brain before the damage becomes irreversible. Take injuries seriously. Improve the science. Keep researching. And never confuse toughness with pretending that the human body has no limits. Aaron Hernandez's legacy will always be complicated. His victims and their families deserve to be remembered. His criminal convictions cannot be erased by a medical diagnosis. His football talent also cannot be denied. At the same time, his brain became one of the most important CTE cases of its era. That is the uncomfortable truth. A young man can be responsible for terrible actions and still have suffered from a serious neurological disease. Both realities can exist without canceling each other out. Perhaps the most important question is no longer what Aaron Hernandez's brain can tell us about his past. It is what it can teach us about the future, because the goal of medical research is not to explain tragedy after it happens. The goal is to prevent the next one. The final lesson, what Aaron Hernandez left behind. In the end, Aaron Hernandez's story is not just about an NFL career that collapsed, a criminal conviction, or a brain that shocked medical researchers. It is about the questions that remained after all the headlines disappeared. At only 27, Hernandez was gone. Yet when researchers examined his brain, they found severe stage 3 CTE and damage that was remarkably advanced for someone so young. The discovery did not explain every decision he made, and it does not erase the harm caused by his actions. But it did reveal something the football world could no longer ignore. Repeated head trauma can leave consequences that remain invisible until it is too late. That may be the most important lesson. A player can look healthy, he can pass a physical, he can sign a multi-million-dollar contract, he can step onto the field in front of thousands of fans and perform like a superstar, and still, something may be happening inside the brain that nobody can see. That is why football has to keep evolving. Players need better information about long-term brain health. Coaches need to take symptoms seriously. Parents need to understand the risks before young athletes begin years of repeated contact. Medical professionals and researchers need the resources to keep studying CTE and improve detection, prevention, and treatment. Because once severe neurological damage is discovered after death, the opportunity to protect that person has already passed. Hernandez's story also offers a lesson about responsibility. We should not use CTE as a simple excuse for violence. Because science cannot prove that the disease caused his specific crimes, at the same time, we should not dismiss the diagnosis simply because it does not explain everything. Two truths can exist at once. A person can be accountable for terrible actions, while doctors can still discover that person suffered from serious brain disease. That balance matters because the goal should not be sensationalism. It should be understanding. Hernandez's daughter will carry the consequences of his story for the rest of her life. The victims and their families will carry theirs. Researchers will continue studying his brain, and football will continue facing the responsibility of making the sport safer for the players who come next. Perhaps that is the legacy Hernandez never intended to leave. His greatest impact may not be measured by touchdowns, contracts, or headlines. It may be measured by whether the NFL learned something from the damage doctors found too late. If this story made you look at football differently, subscribe, like this video, and share it with another NFL fan. And tell me in the comments, do you believe the NFL is doing enough to protect players from long-term brain injuries? Type 1 for yes or 2 for no. The game will continue. The competition will continue. The hits will continue, but the understanding has to continue too. Because a football legacy should not only be measured by what a player accomplished on the field, It should also be measured by what future players learn from what happened after the final whistle.